next speaker this morning is Kendall Becker. Kendall is currently pursuing a PhD in ecology here at USU.
Thank you.
Kendall?
Hello. Thank you, Darren, and thank you all for being here. Today, I'm going to talk about the effects of a low to moderate severity fire on a snag population in an old growth forest in the Sierra Nevada. I'm going to focus on three things: the fire effects on snag demography, the fire effects on pre-existing snags and what happened to those snags after the fire, and also whether we can model snag consumption as a function of snag attributes and neighborhood metrics that describe what is in the immediate vicinity of individual snags. So this is an image, a photograph of an old growth forest in the Sierra Nevada. And you can see a number of key elements of that forest, including large diameter trees, large snags, and logs. My research focuses on snags because they're known to be very ecologically important, but are less thoroughly studied than other forest components. For decades, snags have been recognized as a valuable resource that provides habitat for nesting and foraging of cavity-dependent birds and mammals. Snags and the logs they become also provide food sources and habitat for vertebrates, invertebrates, and fungi. And these organisms break down the wood, decay it, and slowly release nutrients that broadly contribute to forest productivity. Thus, understanding snag creation, persistence, fragmentation, and decay is key to understanding how these forest ecosystems function as a whole. So a disturbance such as fire can rapidly change a snag population by consuming pre-existing snags, burning snags through at the base and causing them to fall, and also recruiting snags through tree mortality. And I'd like to visually demonstrate how that rapid change can take place by comparing a set of matching pre- and post-fire photographs that we have taken from the same vantage point. I'd like to just recognize briefly the photographer who's in the audience, Tucker Furness. So this is the pre-fire, and then this is the post-fire of the same scene. And I'm gonna run that by you one more time, and I'd like you just to notice a couple of details. Take a look at what was in this upper left-hand corner, this prominent snag, and then also take a look at these small diameter trees when we look at the post-fire photograph again. Okay, so we can see that the large snag either fell or was consumed, and that we have snag recruitment in the smaller diameter classes. So studying fire in the West and how fire affects snags is important because we're anticipating reduced snowpack and warmer winter temperatures that are going to lengthen the summer fire season. And we're expecting that to result in more ignitions, drier fuel, and greater area burned. So with that in mind, accurate predictions of inputs to and outputs from the snag pool can potentially help managers who are tasked with balancing human safety and habitat demands in areas that have burned. A key research need is pre- and post-fire comparisons, where we are tracking individual snags from before a fire event to after the fire event, so we can see what these individual outcomes are. And a couple of studies, I believe there are two that I'm aware of that have done this in the Sierras. Pinus et al. 2006 found that after a prescribed fire, the density of sound and rotten snags increased, whereas Stevens and Mogodas 2005 found that the density of sound snags increased, whereas the density of rotten snags decreased. So their findings are slightly different, which isn't too surprising because they were done in slightly different areas in the Sierras and they were subjected to different prescribed burns. But it does highlight an important research need for us, which is that there is value in studying pre-fire and post-fire data of snag populations. The other thing about these two studies is that they both reported the effects of prescribed fire, which highlights another research need, which is that we are not sure how a non-prescribed fire would influence snag populations. So these research needs set the stage for the questions I'm going to address today, which are how a non-prescribed fire of low to moderate severity affects snag demography, what the fates of the pre-existing snags were in that forest, and whether we can develop a model to predict snag consumption based on snag attributes and neighborhood metrics that describe the pre-fire conditions around the snags and also the fire severity in the immediate vicinity of these snags. To address these research questions, I'm using data from the Yosemite Forest Dynamics plot, which is a 25.6 hectare plot in white fir sugar pine forest that's about 500 years old in Yosemite National Park. The plot was established in 2010, and all trees that were greater than 1 centimeter DBH were tagged and mapped. And at that time also, all snags greater than 10 centimeters DBH were tagged and mapped. For the snags, we also recorded decay class and height, as well as DBH and species. And we remeasured those metrics again in 2014, after the plot burned in the fall of 2013. The rim fire was burning in the area at that time, and park management decided to light a fire that burned through the plot in this area in order to protect a sequoia grove that was nearby. The fire return interval of this area is 29.5 years, which is interesting because the fire that last occurred here before this rim fire was in 1900, meaning that about 4 fire return intervals had elapsed since the previous fire. This suggests that the results that we find here could be applicable to other forests in that area that have also experienced prolonged fire suppression. Okay, so to go to my first research question, I was interested in the demographic changes to the snag population as a result of this fire event. And this figure shows the diameter distribution of the snags before the fire. And the panels represent different decay classes. So decay class 1 includes snags that still had fine twigs and needles. Decay class 2, the snags mostly just had small branches left. And decay classes 3, 4, and 5 are combined here. And that represents snags that are losing large bark chunks, and in decay classes 4 and 5, the wood is also softer and more decayed. Okay, so here I've superimposed in red on top of the pre-fire diameter distribution the snags that persisted through the fire. So you can see where the black line is here, where the black is, those bars represent snags that were consumed. And you can see that snag consumption is weighted toward the smaller diameter classes. And this lower panel shows the post-fire snag population. So that's the new snags are shown in gray here. And then in red, you can see the snags that persisted from before the fire. And it's important to note that the snag abundance on this y-axis is 4-fold greater in this lower panel, indicating that there was considerable snag recruitment, primarily in the smaller diameter classes as a result of this fire. Okay, so second, I was interested in looking at the fates of the pre-existing snags. And I began by categorizing the outcomes that we observed. And we saw 3 primary outcomes. We saw snags that persisted and remained standing in blue, snags that fell in orange, and snags that were completely consumed. And I would just like to point out that the snags that were in the larger diameter class that were completely consumed were all in the more decayed classes as well. Okay. And finally, I was interested in looking at volume changes of individual snags that persisted through the fire. And this is visually depicted here, where each snag is represented by 2 dots. A red dot that shows its diameter and height before the fire, and a black dot that shows its diameter and height after the fire. And those 2 dots are connected by a line for each individual snag. And the rows in this panel figure represent different pre-fire diameter classes, just to prevent overly excessive overlap. So we can see in these smaller size classes that if a snag in this small size class persisted, it didn't necessarily lose very much volume. And partly that's because there wasn't so much volume to lose. But in the larger diameter classes, we can see that partial consumption was a common phenomenon. And that is interesting because it shows that snags that persisted through the fire didn't necessarily occupy unburned islands within the fire perimeter, but often did catch fire and experience partial consumption. Okay. Finally, I was interested in modeling whether we could use snag attributes and neighborhood metrics to predict snag consumption. And I did this using logistic regression. I developed 3 models, one based entirely on snag attributes of diameter, height, decay class, and species. A second model that included snag attributes as well as tree density within a 3-meter radius around each snag and tree mortality within a 3-meter radius. And the third model included snag attributes, the live tree neighborhood metrics, and also snag density and snag consumption within that 3-meter radius. And you'll notice that the n values change for each of these models, and that's because in order to calculate tree mortality and tree consumption rates, I needed to have either one live tree or one snag in the neighborhood of the snags that could be included in that model. And so for the result of the first model based on snag attributes, I found that height, snag class, and diameter were significant predictors. And cross-validation showed that a large percentage were correctly classified, but that the model was not very useful and did a poor job correctly identifying consumed snags. So moving on to the second model, that included tree density and tree mortality as significant predictors of snag consumption. And there was a marginal increase in the percentage of consumed snags that were predicted. And in this final model that also included snag consumption, we saw that there was a more than double increase in the percentage of consumed snags that were correctly identified, suggesting that including neighborhood metrics, particularly those related to severity in the immediate vicinity of the snags, could help us predict snag consumption. So to recap what we observed in this forest, we saw that the low to moderate severity fire increased the density of small diameter snags and recruited many more small snags than it consumed. And we saw that snag persistence and consumption were much more prevalent than snag fall. Finally, we saw that the snags that persisted were often partially consumed. And I showed that including neighborhood metrics can help us improve models of snag consumption. And that is an area that I am interested in focusing more on it with my future research. Thank you, and if you have any questions, if there's time. Okay.